The morning air smelled like damp earth and old cardboard, a scent that usually meant new beginnings, but at Elmwood Heights, it just tasted like a trap about to spring. I was 56, a retired structural engineer who'd spent 30 years making sure things didn't end oppos, fall apart. Yet here I was, watching my own life crumble under the weight of a floral blazer and a plastic clipboard. I'd spent 15 years in this house, most of them with my wife Sarah before the cancer took her, and I thought the hardest thing I'd ever do was pack her sun-faded gardening gloves into a box marked in quote, storage and quote, but I was wrong. The hardest thing was try to leave a neighborhood that treated residency like a prison sentence. I was tossing a crate of kitchen supplies into the back of a U-Haul when the clicking of sensible heels on the pavement hit my ears like a death knell, and there she was, Brenda Vance, the president of the Elmwood HOA, and a woman who possessed the unique ability to make, end quote, good morning, end quote, sound like a formal indictment. She didn't end oppos. Say hello. She just stood at the foot of my driveway with her pen poised over a violation sheet, her eyes scanning my lawn like she was looking for a reason to call in a SWAT team. End quote. Arthur, you haven and oppos. Submitted the exit compliance form 4B, end quote. She said, her voice a thin, reedy whistle that set my teeth on edge, and I just stood there, gripping a roll of packing tape, trying to remember the breathing exercises my daughter told me to use. I told her, as calmly as a man with a heavy truck and a broken heart could, that my property had been legally carved out of the HOA jurisdiction by a county ruling 6 months ago. I was a free agent, a ghost in her machine, but Brenda just smiled that tight, terrifying smile that never reached her eyes. End quote. The board doesn't in oppos. Recognize outside rulings that threaten the aesthetic integrity of the Heights, Arthur, and until you pay the $4,000 in oppos. Landscape restoration tax and oppos. This truck doesn't in oppos. Move, or I'm calling the sheriff for property theft, end quote. She whispered, and in that moment, as the red and blue lights of a patrol car she'd clearly pre-ordered began to flicker at the end of the block, I realized that some people don in oppos. Just wanted money. They want to own the very air you breathe. You see, Elmwood Heights wasn't in oppos. Always this way. Back when Sarah and I first moved in, it was just a bunch of folks sharing lawnmowers and drinking cheap beer on Friday nights. But then the end quote, founders in oppos, committee end quote, took over, and suddenly the height of your grass was a moral failing and the color of your curtains was a sign of civil unrest. Sarah loved this place. She planted these white peonies by the porch that bloomed every May like clockwork. And after she passed, I stayed because the house still felt like her. It felt warm. It felt like it had a heartbeat. But over the last 3 years, that heartbeat had been replaced by the ticking of Brenda's stopwatch. I'd become a, quote, non-compliant entity, end quote, because I refused to repaint my mailbox, end quote, desert sand, end quote, when it was clearly, end quote, Ecru, end quote, and I watched as my friends moved away one by one, replaced by people who looked at their neighbors through Ring cameras instead of over fences. My daughter, Maya, who'd made detective over in the city and inherited her mother's sharp eyes and my stubborn streak, had been begging me to move out to the lake with her, telling me that I was living in a gilded cage, and it wasn't an oppos. Until Brenda started tagging my driveway with orange survey paint that I finally listened. The harassment didn't in oppos. Just start with the moving truck. It had been a slow, agonizing crawl for months, beginning with letters slipped under my door at midnight, and escalating to Brenda literally standing on my sidewalk with a light meter to check if my porch bulb was 3 lumens over the limit. I'd walk out to get the mail and find a sticky note on my car about, end quote, fluid leakage, end quote, that didn't in oppos. Exist. Or I'd get a call from the HOA office accusing me of, end quote, auditory pollution, end quote, because I was listening to a ball game on the radio in my own backyard. It was psychological warfare designed to break me, to make me pay the fines just to make the noise stop, but they didn't end oppos. Realized that an engineer knows how to find the stress points in any structure, and Brenda Vance was nothing but a series of cracks held together by a thin layer of ego. Maya arrived that Tuesday to help me with the heavy furniture, and the second she saw the orange tape on the driveway, her entire demeanor shifted from, end quote, doting daughter, end quote, to, end quote, lead investigator, end quote, her eyes narrowing as she took photos of the markings with a clinical precision. End quote. She's overplaying her hand, Dad, end quote. Maya muttered, scrolling through the HOA's digital portal on her laptop while I tried to figure out how to fit a king-size headboard into a 12-foot space. And she pointed out that the fees Brenda was demanding were being routed through maintenance escrow, that didn't oppose. T have a registered tax ID. We went down to the clubhouse that afternoon to settle it, thinking a face-to-face would bring some sanity to the situation, but walking into that office was like stepping into a miniature dictatorship, complete with a portrait of Brenda on the wall and the smell of stale coffee and fear. Brenda sat behind a mahogany desk that looked far too expensive for a non-profit neighborhood group, her fingers interlaced as she looked at us like we were gum on the bottom of her shoe. I laid the county into Oppo's jurisdictional release on her desk, a golden ticket of freedom stamped by a judge, and told her I was leaving, and I wasn't in Oppo's paying a dime for, restoration, of a lawn I'd kept pristine for a decade and a half. Arthur, you're being so difficult, she sighed, the word dripping with a mock pity that made Maya's jaw tighten. And then she looked at my daughter, noting the badge clipped to her belt with a dismissive wave of her hand. And Miss Detective, I suggest you remember that police authority ends where private contracts begin. This is an administrative matter, and we have the right to lien this house until the end Oppo's, visual deadened Oppo's, is settled. The visual deadened, was a new one, a phrase Brenda had invented to describe the supposed drop in property value my, rebellion, had caused. And as we walked out, Maya didn't in Oppo's say a word. She just looked back at the clubhouse with a look I'd seen her use on suspects in interrogation rooms. The look that meant she'd already found the lie and was just waiting for the right moment to pull the thread. Over the next 3 days, it felt like the walls were closing in, as Brenda called the police every single time I moved a box, claiming I was obstructing the fire lane, disturbing the peace with industrial-grade tape dispensers, The officers would show up, look at me with embarrassed eyes and apologize, saying they had to respond to every call, but I could see the pattern forming. It wasn't Oppo's just about the money anymore. Brenda wanted to win. She wanted to see me broken and humiliated on the street, Sarah, and I had called home. The turning point came at 2 a.m. on Friday, when I found Brenda's husband, Gary, a man who moved like a shadow and spoke even less, standing in my front yard with a can of spray paint, trying to mark violations, directly onto the peonies Sarah had planted. I walked out there in my robe, my heart hammering against my ribs, and I didn't in Oppo's. I just asked him if this was really who he wanted to be, a man who defaced a dead woman's garden for a neighborhood association. He looked at me, the canister trembling in his hand, and for a second I saw a flicker of shame in his eyes before he muttered something about, following the board in Oppo's, his orders, and vanished back into the darkness. Maya was up, too, watching from the window, and that was the moment she stopped being a daughter and started being the law, spending the rest of the night on the phone with the county clerk and the state's financial crimes division. She found it, the crack in the foundation that would bring the whole house down. A series of wire transfers from the HOA's main account into a private LLC registered under Brenda's maiden name, a company that supposedly provided, consulting services, but didn't in Oppo's have a single employee or a physical office. It turned out that every fine, every, restoration tax, and every, mailbox uniformity fee, had been padding Brenda's personal retirement fund to the tune of nearly $250,000 over 5 years. The final morning was supposed to be a quiet exit, a final wave to the neighbors who were still brave enough to peek through their blinds. But Brenda wasn't in Oppo's about to let me go without one last show of force. She had blocked the end of my driveway with her own SUV, standing there with the sheriff and 2 deputies, claiming that I was attempting to flee with, contested assets, and that she had filed an emergency injunction to seize the truck. I climbed out of the cab, my knees shaking slightly, but Maya was already there, walking toward the sheriff with a manila folder that felt like a guillotine blade, her voice echoing off the silent houses with a cold, terrifying clarity. Sheriff, before you touch that truck, you might want to look at the warrant issued 45 minutes ago by the district attorney, she said, handing him the papers as Brenda's face went from a smug triumph to a ghostly, sickly white. End quote. Warrant for what? This is a civil dispute. End quote. Brenda shrieked, her voice cracking as the neighbors started coming out onto their porches, sensing that the wind had finally shifted. Maya didn't oppose to even look at her. She just kept her eyes on the sheriff, pointing out the evidence of the shell company, the forged signatures on the end quote, visual debt end quote, notices, and the illegal tracking of residents and oppos, private finances. End quote. It's fraud, racketeering, and third-degree larceny. Brenda, end quote. Maya finally said, turning to face her with a smile that was as sharp as a razor, end quote. And since you used the HOA's official mail to send those fake fines, we're looking at mail fraud, too, which is a federal flavor of trouble you really aren't an oppos. Dressed for, end quote. The scene that followed was something out of a movie I never thought I'd star in. The sheriff, who had clearly grown tired of Brenda's constant calls and ego, didn't an oppos. Hesitate. He handed the folder to his deputy and walked straight up to Brenda, telling her to put the clipboard down and turn around. The sound of the handcuffs clicking shut was the most beautiful piece of music I'd heard since Sarah used to play the piano on Sunday afternoons. A sharp, metallic end quote, snap end quote, that signaled the end of a 15-year era of manicured tyranny. Brenda was sobbing, her floral blazer rumpled as she was led toward the back of the patrol car, her husband, Gary, standing on their porch across the street, looking like a man who had finally been released from a spell. I looked at the house one last time, at the peonies that were still standing tall despite the orange paint and the chaos, and I realized that a home ISN and oppos, the four walls or the rules written by small-minded people with too much time on their hands. It's the piece you carry with you when you leave. I climbed back into the truck, Maya in the passenger seat with her feet up on the dash, and as we drove past the end quote, Elmwood Heights, a community of excellence end quote, sign I didn't an oppos, feel a single ounce of regret, only a vast, open horizon of silence. The HOA was dissolved 3 months later after the audit revealed they were nearly bankrupt from Brenda's end quote, consulting fees end quote, and the neighborhood eventually went back to being just a place where people lived without the clipboards and the light meters. But it makes you wonder, doesn't an oppos, how many of us are living in places where we've traded our dignity for the sake of a end quote, need end quote, neighborhood, and how many an oppos, Brenda's and oppos, are out there right now, measuring the height of your grass while they hollow out the soul of your community? Some people say I was too hard on her, that she was just a woman who took end quote, order end quote, too far, while others think the whole neighborhood was complicit for letting her rule for so long. So, I've got to ask you, if your neighbor was being squeezed by a system like that, would you be the one peeking through the blinds, or would you be the one helping them pack the truck? Tell me in the comments if you think the HOA system is a necessary evil for property values, or just a legalized way for bullies to play God. Because I'm sitting here by the lake, breathing easy for the first time in years, and I'm starting to think that the most valuable thing you can own ISN and oppos, a house. It's the right to be left the hell alone.